Hello, everybody, and welcome again to ChessLexer.com. This is International Master David Vigorito, and today we're going to be looking at some more double king pawn openings from Black's point of view. A while back, I did a couple of these. I did one on the Exchange Spanish for Black, and I also did one kind of on beating the club openings, which covered some kind of shaky lines from White's point of view, like the King's Gambit, the Ponziani openings like that. So, you know, a lot of players, when they want to play double king pawn, they'll oftentimes have like their favorite defense to the Spanish, which is the most popular and the strongest opening, and Black has many different ideas for defense there. But a lot of players are a little more lost against some of the unusual White tries, which perhaps aren't so easy to study because you don't see many games with them. You don't see many grandmasters playing, you know, the Scotch anymore, or the Four Knights, or the Italian game, and especially you don't see the King's Gambit too much, or the Ponziani, which I covered before. So we're going to start looking at some of these more reputable lines for White that are not so popular, so that we can at least handle them with Black, because they're certainly more popular at club level than at grandmaster level, especially compared with something like the Spanish, which is almost exclusively played in double king pawn games. So this time we are going to look at the Italian game, which is one of White's better choices if White wants to avoid the Spanish. And this is going to start e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. Now, the reason you don't see this too often at high level is that really White doesn't have much chance to gain an advantage. This kind of line has been worked out since, you know, the beginning of time, and Black's defense has been worked out pretty well. Now here Black has a couple of good responses. Knight f6, the two knights defense, and bishop c5, which is like the pure Italian game. Bishop c5 is the move we're going to look at. I think it's a little easier to study, and I also think it can help you learn more in general about the open games. The two knights, White has a couple of choices. White can still play quietly with d3, after which bishop c5 would transpose to something that we'll look at. And White can also play the most critical move, knight g5, after which Black has a couple of choices, bishop c5, which is a little risky, just leaving f7 hanging, and the main line d5, he takes d5, and here the main line is b5. Black can also play knight d4, and the main line is really knight a5, which is a pawn sacrifice. And knight takes d5, of course, leads to the famous fried liver attack if White plays knight takes f7. Now these lines are very tactical, and then they can be fun, and perhaps we'll look at that sometime too. But for now we're going to look at bishop c5. Also here White can play a line like d4, the two knights, e takes d4, e5. So the lines are a lot more tactical, which might sound more fun, but bishop c5 can also lead to a tactical game, and I think there's not as much memorization, and you're less likely to have like a big early accident playing this way. Now, White has a couple choices here. The main line is c3, and White can also play b4, the Evans Gambit, and White can also play like d3 or castles. Now some of these lines will transpose if White plays a setup with d3, c3 castles, which is like a quiet line. So c3 is the main move, but first we're going to look at a couple of the alternatives. So we're going to look at the Evans Gambit, b4, and there's a couple choices here, and I'm going to show two lines that aren't so popular but are quite reasonable to play. An opening like the Evans Gambit, you have to have something in mind, but you know, depending on your level 2, you might not face it that much, so you don't really want to spend like, you know, a week analyzing games in the Evans Gambit for Black if you're not going to face it too often. So I'm going to look at two kind of practical choices. Bishop b6 is the Evans declined, which, you know, you can say it's a chicken move, but it's very practical and probably a little annoying to White, not really what White wants to face. And there's a way of accepting the gambit that I find very interesting. That's bishop takes b4, c3. Now the main lines are bishop a5 and bishop e7, and bishop to c5 used to always be played. But there's a very funny move here that, for some reason, I like this move. Maybe because I like it in a couple other openings. And that's bishop d6, which looks funny, like it's violating beginner rules, putting the bishop there. But to me, it actually has a certain logic to it, because White's whole plan is to sacrifice this b pawn in order to play c3 and d4 quickly. And like the cornerstone of defense in almost all double king pawn games is to hold the e5 point. That's what knight c6 on move 2 is. Even the Spanish is designed to hold the e5 point. So the point of this move, bishop d6, is after d4, we're overprotecting e5. And after every other move, bishop a5, bishop e7, d4 attacks e5. Here it doesn't, so we can play knight f6. And one point is if d takes e5, we're actually going to take with a bishop. If we take with a knight, then knight e5, bishop e5, f4 gives white, an initiative, followed by e5. So we would play bishop takes e5, followed by like d6. And if knight e5, we're attacking the bishop on c4. And if the bishop retreats, we can play d6. And f4 isn't going to be the end of the world now, because we can always just retreat, and there's no e5. The point is that we recaptured on e5 in this position with tempo, so we had time to play d6. So if white doesn't take on e5 and say castles, we castle, and the e-pawn, white's e-pawn, is under attack. And if something like rook e1, we can play h6 to stop this pin bishop g5. We could also play rook e8. And the idea here is actually just play like rook e8, and maybe bishop f8, and then d6. So the bishop is on d6 only temporarily. But it's an interesting idea. Also, if white chooses to pin here with bishop to g5, we can do h6, bishop h4, and bishop back to e7 already. Because if white takes on e5, we just take on e4, and we're still up a pawn. So bishop d6 is an interesting idea, and it's not played too often. So if you'd like to be up a pawn, but don't want to go into these super theoretical lines, then this is one way to take the pawn. Now, a nice safe way to play is bishop b6. And if white plays slowly like castles, we'll just do d6, and we'll get a position similar to some of the slow lines, except white is thrown in b4, which is a double-edged. It gains space, but it also takes time, white pushing these pawns on the queen side. So the critical move is a4. And here we play a6, which is considered a little stronger than a5. And white has a couple choices here. White can play like in this way with like a5, bishop a7, c3, knight f6, d3, d6, which is very similar to some of the slow lines, except with these pawns pushed. Or white can play bishop b2 and attack this pawn right away. And after d6, b5, ab, rook a1, bishop a1. Black could play knight e7 or knight a5, but then white might play d4 with some initiative. So I think knight d4 is a pretty easy solution. And there's not really any reason white should have anything special here. White just spent a lot of time pushing pawns. So the main try for white here is to play knight c3. And then after knight f6, black is all set to just play like develop normally, d6, maybe bishop g4. So the real try for the initiative is knight to d5, and after knight d5, e takes d5, knight d4. Now the reason this works is if knight e5, castles, d6, it's a little uncomfortable for white if this knight comes back to f3, bishop g4, and if the knight goes back to d3, white's really bottled up, and probably like queen h4 with the idea of bishop g4. Black develops very quickly. So usually white does not take this pawn and simply castles. And then knight f3, queen f3. d6 is very solid for black. Again, as is typical in some of these double king pawn games, black can consider playing queen h4 very early because there's no knight on f3 and the queen is active there, supports bishop g4, and also kind of eyes black's fifth rank here. It helps prevent d4, hits the bishop on c4, and black doesn't really have any problems here. So the Evans gambit is not really so scary. You can learn some of the really sharp accepted lines if you want to go into them, but it seems like white always gets enough compensation or wins the pawn back. So these are a couple solutions that are pretty reasonable. So now we're going to look at white's main line, c3. And after knight f6, there's a couple ways to play. d3 is the quiet method, which you can expect to face quite a bit. And here black plays a6. Some of this is like a bit of a cat and mouse game. This is kind of a waiting move, ready to play bishop a7 in response to any kind of b4, a4. And black's point here is black delays castling just in case white doesn't castle and tries to launch an attack. And the reason black doesn't do d6 right away is that black might want to play d5 in one go. Like if white does some kind of really ambitious setup with like queen e2 and knight bd2 to f1, something like h3, g4 instead of castling, we would want to meet that wing attack with play in the center by playing d5 in one move. So a6 is kind of considered the most flexible move. And here, again, if knight bd2, we can consider castling here because any kind of kingside play we can play d5 quickly, and also there's no pin bishop g5. We could also play bishop a7. Now the main move is bishop b3. The reason for this move is to avoid any possible knight a5 for black, which isn't really threatened yet because the e-pawn is hanging. But it's still a prophylactic move. Bishop b3, bishop a7, and then the main line will go castles, castles, knight bd2, d6. This is kind of a main position. And white has three different moves here, really. h3, rook e1, and knight c4. Against h3, there's a couple good ways to play. You can just play h6. You can play bishop e6, or a plan that I like is to play knight e7, rook e1, knight g6. I like this knight over on g6. Stops any kind of knight h4, and also there's the possibility of coming into f4 ourselves, sometimes even with knight h5 and queen f6. And one common tactic here is if you ever do knight h5, and white does knight takes e5, you can either play knight takes e5 or de, and after white takes on h5, this d3 pawn is hanging to either the knight or the queen. So sometimes we can make a move like knight h5 work tactically. It's like a positional move we want to play, but that's one way to make it work. Rook e1 is not so popular at a high level because black has this way to force immediate action. Black could just play like h6 or bishop e6 or still play knight e7, but the most ambitious way is to play knight g4, which looks a little like a beginner's move, just attacking f2. But there's a specific plan. After rook e2, we're going to play king h8. And the idea is to just play f5. For example, if h3, we're going to do knight h6, and after knight f1, we will still play f5. Because if bishop h6, gh, black's king isn't really in any danger, and black's getting an initiative on the king side, ready to play like queen f6. There's some pressure on f2. Black has two bishops. This bishop is very strong, and black has tended to score pretty well here. So that's kind of a nice plan, nice to know. So the most solid move for white is knight c4. And again, here there's a few options, but again, I like this plan, knight e7. Now one point is, again, we're going to try to do knight g6, is if white plays this kind of thematic idea, bishop g5, knight g6, knight h4, a common idea. The idea is to maintain this pin, and now if we can't do h6 because of knight g6, followed by like a discovery, like something like knight takes d6. So the key move here is to play after knight h4, king h8. And our idea here, say after some move like knight e3, is to play h6 to break the pin. And if knight g6, fg, This pawn structure isn't bad for black at all, say after bishop h4, because these pawns are very useful, and we can always still play g5, and we have an open f-file. So it's a pretty comfortable position for black. So this slow Joko piano is not really anything too dangerous. It's just kind of an equal game where the stronger player has a chance to outplay his opponent. So now we're going to look at the critical main line, which is not very popular anymore, and that's d4. And here, we can't really hold the e5 point anymore, but that's okay because we're counterattacking the e-pawn, and there's some tactics here. So we're going to take on d4. Now the main move is c takes d4. There's a couple other lines that we will peek at. One is castles, and here we're going to take the e-pawn. A couple kind of rules to me in some of these open games is, one, don't be afraid. Like if you think your opponent has kind of violated principles, you have to kind of take him head on. You also don't want to be greedy and just start taking everything. Like in an opening like the Evans Gambit, you don't necessarily have to take everything. But here we should take the e-pawn because we can. There's not really a direct punishment. Black hasn't done anything wrong. So after knight takes e4, cd, we play d5, counterattack. And after dc, dc, if queen takes d8, the right way to take is with a king to avoid a pin on the e-file. And then after rook to d1, bishop d7, black is up a pawn. White might be able to find a way to get it back, but opposite bishops, black has good light square control, and probably black is at least equal here. More ambitious would be queen e2, and here black has a couple. Queen d3 is the old move, which is sufficient for equality. It can get complicated after rook e1, f5, but there's a simple way to play too, and that's queen to e7. And now if rook e1, there's not a real pin on the e-file, so we can do knight takes c5. Because of queen c4, we just have knight e6, or even bishop e6. So if queen takes c4 right away, we have knight takes c5. And we're up a pretty good pawn, ready to play knight e6 next to shield the e-file, or even bishop e6. And black is up a pawn. So this line isn't so dangerous. Now another thing white can do here, which is pretty reasonable, this might actually be white's best move, is to play e5. And now we play d5, kind of a thematic counterattack. And this looks a little bit like a Max Lane attack or something like that, but here it's even better for black. After bishop b5, e takes f6 is not so good because we do dc, fg, rook g8. And this might look scary because there's a pawn on g7, but black has two bishops and great central control. All set to play either d3, we control d4, this g-pawn isn't really going anywhere. Black can quickly castle long. This is a kind of position that might look scary at first here, but if you plug it into any kind of analysis engine, it will quickly tell you that black is much better. White basically is just sacrificing stuff to make it look scary, but it's not really dangerous. So the right move is bishop b5. And then after knight e4, c takes d4. Both bishop b6 and bishop b4 check are good. One line could be bishop b4, knight d2, knight takes d2, bishop c6, bc, knight d2, castles, and now white has to castle, otherwise we'll play bishop a6, and then black plays c5. Black has two bishops, and no problems here. White doesn't have any initiative. That's a key thing in most of these open games, is with the initiative, and a lot of times just by playing sensibly we can diffuse that. Just don't be too greedy. But e5 might actually be the best move, just because white is probably not worse after playing e5 on move 6. But let's look at the stuff that looks scary. C takes d4, bishop b4 check. Now there's two moves for white, knight c3 and bishop to d2. Knight c3 is probably dubious. This is an old-fashioned attack called the Mahler attack, and we just do knight takes e4. White has to castle, otherwise white will have no compensation at all for the pawn. We play bishop takes c3. And now if white just takes back, b takes c3. This is a good example. We don't want to be greedy with a move like knight takes c3. Too many open lines, and queen e1 check would just win right away. we're up one pawn. Let's keep it at that and just play d5 and play in the center. And here black is just clearly better, no matter where this bishop goes. Just a pawn up, solid position in the center. White's two bishops isn't really compensation, but all of black's pieces are good. So white has to play more sharply with d5, which is funny because black has a few pieces hanging. This guy's hanging, this guy's hanging, and this guy's ready to get pinned. Now the main move here is bishop f6. We're also going to look at another move if you want to avoid some of these complications. And now after rook e1, knight e7, rook takes e4 with the idea of d6. d6, white is down a pawn, so white has to find a way to keep the initiative going, and the only way really is bishop g5, and here the main line goes bishop g5, knight g5, h6, and if the knight retreats, we just play bishop f5 followed by castling, so the line goes queen e2, hg, rook a to e1, which wins the piece back. Now castling is bad because after rook takes e7, white just has such control of the e-file. It's a very strong position, but does this move bishop e6, d takes e f6. And this looks a little scary, but it's very sharp, and you got to keep in mind that black is up a pawn, has a solid position, and this if black can simplify, this e6 pawn probably won't last forever. So white has to really do something quickly. So the method that has been tried here is rook e3, c6, rook h3, which is very ugly, but it's the only move to keep anything going. Rook takes, g takes. Now queen h5 is threatened, so g6, and black will soon play d5, one example being queen d2, d5, queen c3 attacking f6, d4, and black is all set to play either queen a5. If the queen goes to like f3, we can play queen a5 hitting the rook, followed by queen f5, and try to castle long as quickly as possible. So this is kind of a real way to try to refute this line, but there's also a solid way to play that I'll show you in case you can't remember all this, and that's to play knight e5. And now after bc, knight takes c4, queen d4. There's a couple good choices. Anand had this position once against a computer, and he simply castled, and after queen e4, knight d6, black was a pawn to the good. White has some compensation with some space, but black has a solid extra pawn. And another way to play would be to play f5, queen takes c4, d6, followed by castling, which is also very solid in a pawn up and looks good for black. So the smaller attack isn't really so dangerous. I mean, there's some danger, but if you know what you're doing, it's not too dangerous. So the most solid move for white, which leads to equality, is bishop d2. Now, one way of playing this is to just play bishop takes d2, knight b d2, d5, isolating one of white's pawns, ed, knight d5. But after queen b3, white has some chances to get a little initiative here. It almost looks like a queen's gambit accepted. And also after knight a5, queen a4 check, knight c6, white can repeat with queen b3. And if c6, white might have some chance for a small advantage. It's kind of a boring position. Now another way to play, which I think is the simplest and a very easy equality, is to be consistent and play knight takes e4, just grabbing a pawn. So white has to win his pawn back by bishop b4, knight b4, bishop f7. I actually remember I had this position back when I was like 1900, and when my opponent did this, I was like scared to death. I didn't normally play e5, and I had no idea what I was doing, and I assumed I had blundered. But as it happened, I had played all kind of normal moves and hadn't really violated anything, so even though it scared me, I didn't really have any problems in the game. King f7, queen b3 check. And there's two ways to play. One is d5. This is a little riskier. Knight e5 actually isn't really so good because of this funny move king e6, and after queen takes b4, c5, black's king looks a little precarious, but black develops very quickly and is trying to undermine the knight on e5 and is ready to play a quick c takes d4, queen b6. So I think it's actually more sensible for white to just play queen takes b4, and then after something like rook e8 or rook f8, castles, king g8. It's about equal, but you have to be a little careful here just because this knight will eventually find a nice square to settle here on e5. We don't want to get like a knight against bad bishop. So a simple way to play this is after queen b3 is to just play king f8, and after queen takes b4, we play queen e7. And because we're lined up against white's king, white has to trade queen e7, king e7. And this position is equal. You still have to take a little care after like castles. We have to watch out a little bit for rook e1, and like if the king goes to d8, we might have to watch out for knight e5. But here white can do castles, white can do knight d2, knight d2, king d2, or white can play knight to c3, after which we take and takes back. And all these positions are about equal. I've actually played this ending like many, many times in blitz games, and I found that even though it looks pretty dull, both sides can really play for a win here. You know, white develops pretty quickly. Black has some possibilities with the bishop and an ending, like after black does d6, maybe b6 and c5. You know, there's some chances because the pawn structure is not symmetrical and both sides have a majority on one side. So even though it's an equal ending after 12 moves, I think both sides can actually try to win here. So again, we have a position that's equal where the stronger player can try to outplay his opponent. So that concludes my coverage of the Italian game for black. You see there's a lot of kind of dangerous lines, but once you have an idea what to do, it's not really so scary, and it's also not too much to memorize. A lot of it is some common sense and a little bit of calculation. So in future lectures, we'll look at some of White's other games where White avoids the Spanish, stuff like the Scotch and the Four Knights, and I'll show you how to diffuse some of these systems. So thanks again for joining us at chesslecture.com. Until next time, this is International Master Dave Vigorito. Thanks.